I get the pleasure of introducing Sam Ramji. We were just talking about product innovation at Google. Well, we're now have a treat who is the vice president of product at Google. And also responsible for a lot of the cloud services. A couple of things you might not know about Sam. He started coding at age 9. He's also a serious and accomplished heavy metal guitar player. So if you talk about creativity, you're certainly going to get the best of both worlds coming out of Sam. It's remarkable also, he founded the open source project at Microsoft, where he demonstrated the open source technologies and tools to Bill Gates himself and actually convinced them to do more open work as opposed to just proprietary work. So hoping we can learn much more about ecosystems innovation especially, and opening systems overall. We were talking about openness earlier and how important that actually is. He's an accomplished dungeon master. Having kids, I'm hoping I might be better at that myself. He's an incredible, passionate advocate for equality and equal rights. Also, he was the CEO of Cloud Foundry, one of the consortia to actually help compete with Amazon Web Services. And the person who succeeded him was one of his lieutenants, a woman, done very, very well. So for any number of reasons, we are extraordinarily fortunate to have Sam among us, also just a terrific guy. So with that, let me introduce Sam. Take it away.
Thank you very much. Can I get a clicker? Awesome, thank you so much. Good morning. What a pleasure it is to be here. I'm going to offer you a view into a collective work. So Brian Kirshner and I have been working on this material for about a decade, massively inspired by the work of Parker, Van Alsten, Chowdhury, Hajdu, Evans, many more. Many of those academics have paved the way for us to understand what we're in the middle of. One of my favorite expressions, I'm also a Zen Buddhist, there's a Zen expression which is, don't ask a fish about the ocean. So many of us say, well, developers are developers are developers, and that's why you need them. It's not really a gift to anybody. It doesn't give you a cognitive tool. So what I'm hoping to offer you today are a specific claim, which is that when one side of your multi-sided market is developers, which is not true in all platforms, but when one side of the market is developers, you have very different network effects because developers network among themselves, and you have to manage that differently. So if you accept the claim, I'm going to try to offer you a few cognitive tools to understand what that looks like and enable you to take intelligent action for yourself. So I hope that makes sense. This is the first time I'm giving this talk. We felt like for such an august audience, it needs to be built from scratch. So I hope you'll forgive me. I've brought a few notes to make sure I get it right. So we're living in an age of platforms. That's why we all came to MIT today. Specifically to situate Google, Google aims to build great developer tools because we are a company of platform businesses. Think about search and ads, think about YouTube, think about Android and Play, many others. So platform businesses are defined by the availability of high-quality third-party content, right? That brings new consumers and new content producers, creates a flywheel, right? A virtuous cycle where you end up with more of both. Now, where the platform's content is built by developers, it must be our mission to win those developers and to enable them to build high-quality content. Apple's done a wonderful job of this if you look at what happened starting in 2007 with Xcode, with design guidance, with the App Store, and with a arduous acceptance process to make sure that in general the goods were of high quality, but the developers were trained through defects or through guidance into producing high quality goods. So this is kind of magical. As a recovering software engineer and as a trustee of the experience of millions of developers' experiences, accountable for Android, Chrome, Angular, Google Cloud, and others, I think that we're at a moment where we can see developer ecosystems taking root and having an impact. So I hope to leave you optimistic and with some cognitive tools to take new actions as you shape the future. So from a developer standpoint, this is certainly the best time in history to be a developer. Our craft is respected, right? We're in an era of rising demand, and it's only getting better. Our choices and our opportunities continue to expand. We've got more form factors to be able to develop to. That's fascinating. Even better, we've got more tools and more choice and more ability to change the materials with which we work. I'll talk a little bit more about open source and the fact that it offers a standardization process for software development, much like 2x4s and other standardization enable the construction industry to bloom. Software development is cognitive construction. So we have access to new cognitive tools to adapt to these new platforms. Most surprisingly, factual current statements, right? Rio Tinto's future miners will be software developers, right? Software developers are the new pharmaceutical inventors, right? Because AI is creating new drugs through simulation and molecular analysis. So the field of use of software development is expanding dramatically. Now, software developers, if we want to think about this, aren't magical. They're not fairies. There's not any butterflies that you have to catch, right? They're people who use code to produce meaningful outcomes. If you just always come back to those three beliefs, right? Whether you call it cognitive construction or something else, they're people who use code to make meaningful things happen. And they find joy in doing this. So software developers are generally a positive, curious community, and they are largely self-taught. Stack Overflow recently offered a survey in which they found that 94% of software developers are at least partially self-taught. Nearly the same number, 87%, said that they enjoy learning new technology. So if you're offering them something new, the chances are pretty good that they could be interested in it if you attract them. You'll have to speak to the human. I'll talk more about that in a moment. It is a community that realizes that we stand on the shoulders of giants and looks to the inspiration of individual developers. Now, for me, I draw inspiration from people like this, Grace Hopper. Anybody start coding on one of these? It's a little before my time, so I have a huge amount of respect for those who came before and worked on mainframes. My father actually was a chemical engineer, as he would tell you, for Shell, but really he was a mainframe programmer because programmers didn't really exist as such, right? We didn't elevate the craft of software. Probably everybody knows who these two are, right? This is Bill Gates and Paul Allen. Bill's resting his hand on a Commodore PET. Anybody use a Commodore PET? So that was, in fact, my first computer in 1980 when I was 9 in 4th grade. Now, it would be considered a stretch to jump from those individual leaders to where we are today, where Stephen O'Grady claims that developers are the new kingmakers. When I started my career in 1994, there's no way, right? There were lines to get employed in, and in fact, I'd graduated with a degree in neuroscience and artificial intelligence. That was the AI winter. If you said that you did AI, you went to the back of the hiring line, so we didn't say that, right? But now, of course, AI is dead. Long live AI. So what's changed? The rate of technology innovation underneath it is almost impossible to understand. So I'm going to put this in context with light. So 2 researchers from the UK looked at the study of how fast light had improved. So it turns out the Dark Ages, a world lit only by fire, which is the title of a brilliant book on the Dark Ages. I strongly recommend it. We're really dark. So pounds per lumen only improved by a factor of 3 in 500 years from 1300 to 1800. However, it improved by a factor of over 3,000 in the following 200 years. So it took 200 years to go from relative scarcity to relative abundance. To put our current world into that context, it's only taken 20 years for us to go and improve the performance of semiconductors by a factor of nearly 4,000. In that same time, storage costs have improved by almost 20,000. This starts to get into the area of human reasoning that we might call the back of the chessboard. We're really bad at reasoning about this. But hopefully with the example of light, we can start to say, this is a path to start to come to grips with the scope and scale of the change, realize may be impossible to understand, so let's go find some new frameworks. We step back and look at the big picture, the magnitude of the drop of cost of light made a change in the world that we can see from space. Hopefully that's fairly visible for you. Now what's invisible is the shift of the cost of storage, networks, and data. Right? So when we look at compute costs, how do you find out the moral equivalent of this? Turns out that's mostly invisible, so we needed to create some new tools. Here's a map of all of the devices connected to the internet as of 2014. Right? So you have to get in, sniff it, make it visible. So hopefully this starts to give us a sense of an expanding connected universe laid over our explicit geographical map. Now to get non-geographical, to move into a different coordinate space, we can look at some work from Georgia Tech and the Center for Global Enterprise. So here's a map of the internet universe as powered by businesses. This is a map of API calls. Right? This is interconnectedness, invocations from individual endpoints to pools of data powered by APIs. The size of the circle is kind of the volume. Now there's some massive ones here. Google in particular, I have the privilege of serving the Google Maps community among other Google developer communities. We have about 37 million websites and apps that connect to our infrastructure to process geodata. You don't have to be a digital native, though. If we take a look at Philips, they're adding programmability to light. So light hasn't just gotten cheaper, it's gotten programmable. So every light switch is going to add to the mass that you see in the middle. Nike is adding to this mass by creating wearables. Under Armour is another example. But my favorite thing about Nike is their Fuel Lab has a great slogan: just develop it. So I'm going to nod to our inspiring hosts because they've really laid so much intellectual groundwork for me and Brian over the last decade as we've tried to understand what's the nature of all these things, right? Brian was the first director of open source software at Microsoft. I led platform strategy for the server and tools business as we started understanding how is the world changing and starting to grapple with the early days of cloud. I'm actually going to read this out loud because it's so well stated in the abstract. Firms will choose to innovate using open external contracts in preference to closed vertical integration. Okay, nothing special about development yet. But the locus of value creation moves from inside to the outside. Distinct from physical goods, digital goods afford firms the chance to optimize spillovers. Okay, I'm going to come back to the spillover concept. Further, firms that pursue high-risk innovations with more developers can be more profitable than firms that pursue low-risk innovations with fewer developers. I gave a talk at Web 2.0 in 2010, identifying that APIs let you decouple risk of innovation. You can move the innovation outside of the firm, get rid of the capital risk, allow all that stuff to happen out there, like Darwin's finches. Darwin's finches are a wonderful example of evolution. What you have to pay attention to is most of the finches died. There are only a few different kinds of finches that survived, so you want to then go back and capture the surviving finches. So think about that in this context when we talk about ecosystems. So you have to have a shift in organizational form. You have to have some different perspectives. So I'm going to try to offer you some of those tools. So empirics and theory are converging to shine a light on the shape of the future that's already here but unevenly distributed, to quote William Gibson. This is a classic product pyramid, right? All of us were born in the 20th century. We grew up in the 20th century. Some things are obvious to us, like the 80-20 rule, right? 80% of the profits are going to go to 20% of the companies. The remaining 20% will get distributed to the other 80. Companies are built like this. You want to be the product company, ideally. That's the place of most power in this whole stack. You've got the most intimacy with customers. You enjoy the most information asymmetries. You enjoy the most pricing control. Even if you're a subsystem supplier in the car industry, if you're Recaro and providing chairs, how much do you really get to argue with Ford about the additional value of the chair and what you ought to be able to charge Ford for that, right? The product supplier is really in charge, and on down. So in 2007, Brian and I put together a diagram on the whiteboard for the first time, which has been very durable. Literally firm inversion. Good platform companies are inverted pyramids, and they are contained. They're held in place, and they grow by the massive weight of a very profitable ecosystem that stacks on top of them. And the ecosystem that we're talking about, the platforms we're talking about, have developers as one side. So developers building products, developers adding value to the resellers, developers as consultants fitting that to the final form demanded by the customer. In 20th century mindset, this would be insanity. Why would you want to give up all of that customer intimacy? You don't understand your market anymore. In this case, you're giving that out, right? You're relaxing control. But there's a secret. In the first era of platforms, in the packaged software era of platforms, they weren't connected. You didn't have APIs. The magic came in when platforms started to have APIs. And now every single time a customer uses it, something built by a third-party developer, the data comes back to you. And depending on your business model, the revenue can come back to you as well. So through this entire enormous U-turn, this looping cycle, you end up having an almost magical effect, which is why when we see digital platforms that have developers as one side, you see breakaway outcomes. So hold that in your mind for a moment and think about the difference in the power law. We're no longer in a world of 80-20 when developers are a side of your market. We're actually in a world that looks more like 99-1. The power law shifts. Putting that data loop in context, right, that's this virtuous cycle, a network effect between developers and the meaningful outcomes they're trying to produce. More developers, more meaningful outcomes, more data goes into the platform, and you can enrich the platform. There's another part to it as well. Developers as people have a network effect with code. I'll talk about this in a moment, but it's become obvious to share code, right? We're in an open source era. So the more developers that come onto the platform, they will generally share code with each other. They will create open source frameworks. If you permit that, if you enable that, it can flourish. This literally diminishes the future cost of new developers coming in, and it makes the developers on your platform better, because that shared code is a cognitive asset. You will start to see small shims, then you'll start to see frameworks, then you'll start to see patterns that encapsulate entire ways of thinking about your platform that a new developer can now, instead of learning your platform for a year, they could go and be productive in a week. No kidding. And in many hackathons, they become productive in a half a day, trying to win the competition in 3. So there's a very dramatic difference when developers, as opposed to drivers or renters or merchants or video producers or anything else, is on your platform. I think there's 3 big components, right? There's open source, there's open development, and community. And that's what I'm going to drill into for the next few minutes. So open source is a modern developer's basic expectation. This is how we license source code. This is how we get into it, and we change what we're working with. It's how we share ideas about how we should build. So open source is very dramatic. The more that we enable open source in our platforms, the more developers can benefit. But I'm going to make a distinct argument, which is that open source is its own platform. If you look at platforms like GitHub, right, you end up having these platform overlaps, these beneficial virtuous cycles, where you can start to share code, share ideas, and do something that is very powerful in open source development. It's called a fork. It's a 4-letter word, but GitHub embraced it and said this is basically the ability to copy somebody else's good idea and build upon it while sharing a different opinion. So you can see some projects have been forked 4,000 times. That's a proliferation. It's also a source of data back to you that tells you, I'm doing the right thing for developers. Developers are really interested in what I'm doing. Ecosystem's improving. You should see that as a leading indicator correlated with increased application availability, right? Increased adoption of your platform. Because the developers, on their own, will give you external subsidies. We all know what an external subsidy is in a platform. Anybody here recommended an app for their favorite smartphone platform in the last 6 months? Anybody? Haven't had your coffee yet? Shy? Okay. So I guarantee because you're here, you use smartphones and you use lots of apps, and you have made a recommendation. What did you get paid to make that recommendation? Nothing? Could you have been convinced? Could you be induced to make that recommendation if you'd gotten paid? Probably not, right? But what's an even better question is, could the company whose software you recommended afford to pay all the people making the recommendations? Definitely not. Now multiply that times developers who want to recommend your platform to other developers who will build more applications, who will recommend the applications, who have communities of their own, all building gravity to your platform. Another component in the modern era, and I'm very grateful to the prior speaker at SAP and SAP as a company. My prior job is I was CEO of Cloud Foundry. Cloud Foundry is the core infrastructure for SAP's cloud platform. It's an open source platform that allows you to move your code around and take advantage of new assets. So open source is also a source of portable assets. You can think of it as augmentation for a platform, or you can think of it as new assets that could run in your platform. So at Google, we built Kubernetes and given that out to the open community. Right? It is the #1 container orchestration system in the world. We've also created TensorFlow, which is what we run Google Brain on. It is the #1 machine learning library and repository in the world. But you must also embrace third-party, as we've done with Cloud Foundry and as we've done with Spinnaker, actually pioneered by Netflix, which was mentioned earlier. Second, let's look at open development. So if you've been paying attention to Jeffrey and Marshall and Sangeet, you probably recognize this looks a lot like a pipeline. Look like a pipeline? It is a pipeline. So it was designed to restrict control from developers to improve efficiency and mandate a certain set of outcomes, taking away choice. Now, remember what I said in the beginning, developers want agency. Developers are absolutely independent, difficult. Anybody heard the expression herding cats? Isn't that primarily applied to software engineers? Right. So the pressure from the community of developers is actually breaking apart pipelines into a transitional state. We now have an explosion of third-party, internet-based, open source code control systems, and a Cambrian explosion of CI/CD. This is a small subset. We're tracking over 45 different popular CI/CD systems right now. This is a composable set of capabilities that people can build their own thing around, but a true platform has not yet emerged. There's no one common system that allows you to easily connect these and operate them. So we're in a transitional state as we go from pipelines to what developers in general want as a platform. If you pay attention to this, then you'll get into these communities. You'll make sure your platform works well with a range of these systems. Maybe you can't do all 50. Maybe you can do the top 5. But if you're paying attention, you'll do a good job. You certainly better integrate with GitHub. And finally, I'm going to focus on community. And there's a very particular quote that I love to lead into this concept. So this is Lao Tzu. All streams flow to the sea because it is lower than they are. Humility gives it its power. If you want to govern the people, you must place yourself below them. Sound like a platform? If you want to lead the people, you must learn how to follow them. So because developers are people, we're entering an era where empathy is a competitive advantage. So developers have agency, they have choice, they have interests, they have values. You can't control them, but you can elevate them, or you can let them down. So you have to explicitly manage goodwill as an asset, and you have to look out for bad will. You have to make sure that you keep that balance heavily positive, and you act quickly to deal with bad will. Every platform company makes mistakes. Every platform company has to improve the platform, and sometimes you will acquire one company that adds a particular feature, and in that you kill 10 companies that had the same feature because now you've given it to everyone. That's just part of platform life. If you can be open and transparent, communicate with the community, make sure that they understand where you're going, empathize with their outcomes as opposed to just giving them the raw deal and saying, well, I'm so sorry that your business is dead. It's totally not my fault. You need to have empathy, but you need to do that as a community member. You also need to elevate certain community members and participate with them. One example I want to offer, or 3 examples I want to offer are, let's see if this, Troll Hunter. Anybody pick that out? Just above Mediator. So troll hunters are incredibly important. You have to observe them, value them. They keep the community approachable, and they reduce churn. Now, so see, I'm actually applying service provider business metrics to the community, right? What's the cost of entry? What's the cost of customer acquisition? What's the cost of developer acquisition? And then what's the price of churn? How do we keep churn low? Well, bad behavior, right? Verbally abusive, sexually abusive, like there's a range of bad behaviors that show up in communities. Troll hunters need to keep them out. And even long-standing community members sometimes need to be shown the door in keeping with the standards of that community. Guru makers, just below Mediator, also incredibly important. Anybody been to the theater in the last decade? If you saw the spotlight operator on the street, would you recognize them? Right, they're dressed in black, they're behind the spotlight. It's almost impossible for human vision to perceive it. So the guru makers are the ones who are constantly shining the light on a new person, on a new person, a new solution, and everybody's paying attention to where the spotlight's going. But if you're really careful, you'll follow the path of the light and go, oh, that's the guru maker. There's only a few in every community. You have to really value them. They will have a terrible resume. They won't look good on paper. Nobody will understand. They'll say, well, they just seem to be around. Yeah, but how often are they around? Every single time something interesting happens. That's worth employing. And finally, I want to focus on provocateur. Communities can become complacent, right? So who keeps them moving forward, right? The provocateurs are the ones who point out their own inconsistencies or keep them on the leading edge of learning. Yeah, we've done great at this part of compute, but all these devices are coming online. What are we doing about IoT? These are hard conversations because a tribe tends to say, well, of course, it's conventional wisdom. We don't deal with that. The provocateur keeps kind of nibbling at the edge, right? And they can be a little abrasive. As long as they're not violating the codes of conduct, you should make sure that you value them and keep them around. So I believe that this is a transition. This is a window into an emergent management science. And I'd offer this challenge, right? Community management is product management for an ecosystem. When it's well understood, these will be your most valuable and highly leveraged employees. So I'd say when business schools like MIT Sloan offer an MBA with specialization in community management, then we really will have arrived at an age of platforms. So in closing, if this is what the future looks like, if we need more developers, then platforms are not a zero-sum game. Open source and open development is not a zero-sum game. These are positive-sum games. The communities are adaptive and they evolve. The developer ecosystems are a positive-sum game. Then these dynamics are very powerful. But we have to care for the humans. So we have digital abundance and we have a variety of choices. We're not even close to approaching developer abundance. And we are far from a community with the diversity that mirrors humanity. More people using code to make more things happen grows the pie. And if you think about developers as your competitive weapon, you might start to get grabby. You might try to own them. You might say, oh, we're not going to allow you to build open source code off of our platform. You have to do everything here, right? Now, per Marshall, multi-homing is bad, right? It is the antithesis of platform strategy. But I'd argue when developers are one side of your platform, multi-homing represents code spillover. You could have code that runs on somebody else's platform and yours, and you could attract them to it. One acquisition by Microsoft that was not listed on Peter's excellent chart is a company called Deis. This is an expert in Kubernetes. So Microsoft acquired Deis to become good at Kubernetes, an open source product that Google invented to make sure that we can have an open cloud and we have portability of workloads through containers. So when you have developers as one of the sides in your market, the rules are different and better because developer adoption can lead to another exponential side of growth. So let me summarize and say it's important that you go away from this talk realizing that any new developer could contribute to any number of present and future platforms. And there are many decades of this game to go. So with that, it's a privilege to play a part in it. We will try to deliver tools and technologies that make it better, and we will need the help of everyone here, companies, and particularly academia, to help shine the light so that we are not a fish asking itself about the ocean, but we actually have a map of where to go. So with that, thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.
I have a question.
Peter.
Very interested in your views on the global nature of the developer community.
Yeah.
I think you focused and gave us some of the real important elements of what that, but tell us about what's happening in Africa, what's happening in Eastern Europe, what's happening in India.
Yeah.
I'd be very interested to hear your
So
perspective.
the numbers are fascinating in terms of global development. Nigeria, interestingly, has about 200 million people in population. By the end of the century, they should have about 1 billion. It is the single fastest growing source of developers proportionately and numerically in the world. Relatively underserved, but also composes some very interesting assets. Right, they leapt the digital divide, went straight to wireless connectivity. Right now, all heavily invested in low-end smartphones. You've got a lot of things happening in Cape Town as well, which I think you noted in sort of the growth of platforms in South Africa. That seems to be where it's happening. Eastern Europe is exploding. Georgia, Ukraine, right? Many economies that feel like they've left behind are doing the equivalent of jumping the digital divide from the 2000s and really heavily investing in developers and expecting that they want to create a developer economy because those developer economies can be the best jobs even if they're in the service industry, but could end up creating locally adapted software. Interestingly enough, Georgian is a language that uses a completely different, it's included in Unicode, but the script in Georgian is totally different. It's not Cyrillic, it's not anything else. So when you start to adapt to local culture, you've got a lot of opportunity for local software economy. I think companies such as mine, right, Google must look out for creating a localized global platform that is looking out for local software opportunity, because if you don't, if you act in a rapacious way, then you will end up with non-market forces. Yes, you might win the market, but we know what happens once you win the market. Non-market forces will come into play, regulatory actions will be taken, and then you have to take those as new input and say, we've made a mistake. We had a bunch of things that we weren't looking at in terms of the standards of this culture. We need to do a much better job. Thank you.
I'm impressed. Every conversation I learn something new, and I'm quite sure that my fiancé is going to be quoting more Chinese philosophy to me. Thank you for that as well. You've done a remarkable job of summarizing some of the things that companies could do to build developer communities. What are some of the things that smart companies do wrong? when they build communities? That they think they're doing it, but from your base and your experience, what have the smart companies done wrong?
One of the things that really smart companies do wrong is assume that internal developers are an outstanding proxy for external developers. This is wrong almost 100% of the time. So first, internal developers at software companies, we can generally pay quite a bit more, and we can generally demand a lot more skill coming in. We can also demand a lot more cognitive expense to learn our system. Developers outside the company don't want to pay that cognitive load, even if they're equally intelligent and skilled. So it needs to be much simpler, and it needs to be mapped into their cognitive context, not ours. So we end up wanting to shift the focus outside the firm, but we've built structures that started inside the firm, and we're simply trying to export them as opposed to saying, here's what we do really well, now how do you think, and bring it in. Second thing, and this is equally important, is smart companies don't treat developer experiences as products for whatever reason, because you have very good engineers say, well, I'm an engineer, I'm going to open up an API. Well, is that API a product? Does it have a product manager? Does it have documentation? Does it have a life cycle? Does it have a deprecation policy? All these things that you do in enterprise software, frequently we have no enablement to get them in the right direction, and we have no policy preventing them from creating orphanware. So big companies full of smart engineers need to shift their attention truly outside the firm, and then need to take care of that boundary and make sure that they're only offering goods of quality.
Fantastic. Thank you.
You're welcome. How are we doing on time? I don't want to mess up your agenda. Apologize. Great. Thank you.
Katharina Kort with the German business newspaper Handelsblatt. We heard from SAP how important it is to be not perfect on the market and maybe put some products out and take them off later. Very un-German. How important is that approach also for you at Google or in general?
It's incredibly important. I believe that software is the process of getting things incrementally less wrong. Right? You start out with something, and then you try to make it less wrong. Sometimes you get to a point where you realize, boy, we're not going to get this much less wrong, and it's really wrong, and we got to turn it off. So with that process, you need to respect the community and make sure that you're generating more goodwill than badwill, so that when you engage in that contract with them, you say, by the way, this is still early access preview. This is still alpha. This doesn't represent a commitment to run this thing for 10 years. Learn with us, and we're going to be transparent with you and tell you when the trend is not good. Then we need to make sure that we figure out, can we take care of them with a migration plan, right? We do this all the time. In fact, AI is a particular challenge for Google because we've had things like the predictions API. Well, the predictions API is not nearly as strong as the new thing that we built for the same developers based on machine learning. So we'd really like to transition them. They've built code that's dependent on it. So we have a 12-month transition plan communicating, hey, the predictions API is going away. Here's how to get to the new one. This is why it's way better. We're sorry that we can't continue to support this, but your software is going to get a lot better. You're still going to get some flack, but we have to be sort of open-hearted and empathic in that process. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.